I'm Matt, the MCAT boss. We're going to be doing a practice MCAT CARS passage. That's right, the reading comprehension section that everybody loves to hate, but we can show you it is totally doable. Let's go. The following passage is adapted from an essay on the philosophy of history. The modern historian is often caught in a paradox of their own making, a tension between the scientific impulse to catalog the past and the artistic necessity to narrate it. Since the 19th century, when history began to professionalize itself as a discipline distinct from literature and philosophy, there has been a concerted effort to purge the fictional from the historical record. The ideal historian, in this positivist view, is a transparent medium through which the past speaks for itself, a collector of facts who eschews the seductions of plot, character, and theme. Yet this aspiration toward total objectivity is not merely difficult, it is structurally and linguistically impossible. To write history is to construct a narrative, and to construct a narrative is inevitably to impose a meaning that the raw data of events does not inherently possess. Consider the distinction between a chronicle and a history. A chronicle is a list of events arranged in chronological order. The king died and the queen died. This statement is factual, devoid of causal interpretation. However, it is rarely satisfying to the human mind, which craves intelligibility. A history, by contrast, rearranges these facts into a structure of cause and effect. The king died, and then the queen died of grief. By adding the phrase of grief, the historian has transformed a sequence into a story. They have imputed a psychological motive and a tragic theme to what was previously just a temporal succession. In doing so, they have stepped out of the realm of pure empiricism and into the realm of interpretation. The fact of the queen's death is a matter of record. The meaning of her death is a matter of authorship. This inevitable intrusion of the historian's subjectivity is not a failure of the discipline, but its defining feature. The philosopher Hayden White famously argued that historical narratives are verbal fictions, the contents of which are as much invented as found. This is not to say that the historical events did not happen, or that all accounts are equally valid. The Holocaust, the French Revolution, and the fall of Rome are realities that resist erasure. However, the emplotment of these events, whether they are cast as tragedies, comedies, romances, or satires, is a choice made by the historian. A Marxist historian will look at the French Revolution and see a triumphant struggle of classes. A conservative historian might look at the same events and see a chaotic breakdown of order. Both are working with the same set of facts, yet they produce fundamentally different histories. The facts do not speak. The historian speaks for them. Therefore, the truth of history is not found in its correspondence to a static past, which is gone and inaccessible, but in its coherence as a meaningful discourse. The danger lies not in the use of narrative techniques, but in the denial of them. When historians pretend that their work is a direct, unmediated reflection of reality, they obscure the interpretive lens through which that reality is viewed. They present their specific perspective as universal truth, hiding the moral and political choices that underpin their narrative. A more honest historiography would acknowledge its literary nature. It would admit that while the past is a reality, history is a text, and like all text, it is a construct of language, culture, and the human imagination. By embracing the literary dimension of their craft, historians do not abandon the truth. Rather, they enrich it, offering not just a catalog of the dead, but a vision of what it meant to be alive. All right, so we read the passage. Now let's do the problems. Number 1, the central thesis of the passage is that A, chronicles are superior to histories because they avoid the imposition of psychological motives and causal links. B, historians should focus on collecting raw data and eschew the seductions of plot and character to maintain professional integrity. C, the pursuit of total objectivity in history is impossible because the act of writing history necessarily involves a narrative interpretation. Or D, history should be reclassified as a branch of literature rather than a science to avoid the pitfalls of positivism. Now, A suggests that chronicles are superior, and although it does suggest that chronicles are more factual and are devoid of interpretation in a way that history is not, they don't seem to actually suggest that they are superior. B says historians should focus on collecting raw data, and they don't actually argue that this is what historians should do. They merely point out that they involve a plot and character, that they infer causality and effect. C, the pursuit of total objectivity in history is impossible. This is, in fact, very close to the claim of the passage and provides the reason that the author provides as to why history isn't totally objective. So C is a good option. And D, history should be reclassified as a branch of literature rather than a science to avoid the pitfalls of positivism. They don't seem to be making quite this argument. This is a similar argument to what they've made, but it's not quite what the author is saying. C is a great choice. Number 2, according to the passage, the primary difference between a chronicle and a history is that a chronicle is fictionalized, whereas a history is based on empirical facts. That is definitely wrong. A history is objective, whereas a chronicle is subjective. Again, definitely wrong. They do not argue that history is objective. C, a chronicle is a modern invention, whereas a history is an ancient discipline. They don't make that claim. Or D, a history includes a structure of cause and effect, whereas a chronicle is merely a temporal list of events. And that would be the right answer. Now, in this case, these other answer choices simply don't match what the actual passage claims. All right. And number 3. The author mentions the Holocaust, the French Revolution, and the fall of Rome in the 3rd paragraph, primarily to provide examples of events that are frequently misinterpreted by conservative historians. B, argue that while historical narratives are constructed, the events themselves are undeniable realities. That's a very close match to what they're claiming. C, demonstrate that historical events have a static meaning that does not change over time. They are definitely not claiming that. Or D, illustrate the difference between tragedies, comedies, and satires in historical writing. Now, even though they suggested that this could be the possible interpretive framework that the historian applies, they aren't actually using those as illustrative of the differences between those narrative arcs, but instead are simply pointing out that the actual events are undeniable realities. And it's really easy to fall for the sort of keyword loading that they do in some answer choices, like answer choice D here. All right. Number 4, based on the passage, which of the following statements would the author most likely agree with regarding the role of the historian? A, the historian should avoid moral, political choices in their writing. B, the historian is less important than the events they record. C, the historian creates meaning rather than simply discovering it. Or D, the historian's primary duty is to act as a transparent medium for the past. Now, D again might trigger you to recognize wording from the passage, but in fact, they argued that that was kind of an illusion, this idea that the historian is a transparent medium for the past. They seem to suggest is not the case. And instead, they seem to be arguing that historians create meaning from factual events, but that the meaning themselves is something that comes after. Number 5, suppose a filmmaker produces a biopic about a famous political leader that omits certain controversial facts to portray the leader as a tragic hero. Based on the passage, the author would most likely view this film as A, superior to written history because it acknowledges its artistic nature. B, a chronicle rather than a history because it focuses on character. Remember, they did not suggest that. They suggested chronicle was more like a list of facts. C, an example of emplotment similar to the process of writing written history. This is a very close match to how they argued. Or D, a dishonest distortion of reality that has no place in historical discourse. Now, again, they already told us that history is this narrative emplotment up to the historian. So it's not D. It would be an example of simply using those plot devices. All right. And number 6, which of the following findings, if true, would most weaken the author's argument that history is inevitably subjective? A computer algorithm is developed that can arrange historical data into a narrative without human intervention, yet different algorithms produce different narratives. Now, this again sounds like something subjective. B, neuroscience research reveals that the human brain processes chronological lists of facts more effectively than narrative stories. This seems like a bit of an unrelated fact. C, new primary documents are discovered that contradict the established timeline of the French Revolution. Again, doesn't seem directly related. Or D, 2 historians from opposing political backgrounds produce identical accounts of a civil war using the same set of primary sources. That would be shocking because it sounds like the narrative itself is a fact that could not be disagreed upon if that were true. And that would directly weaken the author's point. I hope this was helpful. For more help, let me know how I can help you. I'm the MCAT boss. Go get that white coat.